So for the agenda, as I said, we'll start with the presentation of the report's key findings, which will also include the topic to be discussed for the second session, which is looking basically at forcedness and mobility and immobility in the context of the Middle East. And then we'll have the first group discussion, which will last 30 minutes. After that, we'll go to the coffee break. We made sure to put 30 minutes of that. I mean, we want to build a network. So yeah, we'll have hopefully some time to meet people and discuss what we kind of learned from the first part. And then we will be presenting specific case studies from countries in the Middle East. And basically, this is to show climate mobility hotspots and what the future might look like from the Middle East. And then we'll have the second round of group discussions to kind of discuss the findings from this presentation. And then finally, we'll be summing up the kind of the key takeaways from the workshop. That will be done by Jake. So we'll also make sure to include Q&A small sessions. To make sure that everything is clear. Thank you so much. Now I will hand. Introductions. Sorry. The introductions. Can we start on that?
Hey everybody, I hope you can you hear, can you see? I hope so. I'm going to start. My name is Jane. I'm Jane Lineker. I'm head of research and forum with the Mixed Migration Center. I'm based in Geneva and I'm doing my best to facilitate the online section of this meeting. It would be really great if those online could introduce themselves with who they are, their affiliation, perhaps. Is that better?
Much better.
Okay, sorry. So yes, I'm Jane, head of research and forum at Mixed Migration Center. Really happy to have so many of you here. If the people online could introduce themselves with their name, their affiliation, and their sort of key area of interest in this topic, that would be really great. I'm just going to go down the list that as I see it and name the first three people. Perhaps Fouad, Alina, and if forgive me if I mispronounce, Al-Moyed.
Thank you so much. My name is Al-Moayed Al-Sayed. I am the Director of Water, Environment and the Climate Change Center from Royal Scientific Society. I would say, do you hear me? Okay. So I would say I'm not quite familiar with the climate change and mobility, but I've been working in climate change and in physical science of climate change, and I'm interested, in fact, to learn more about this, and I enjoyed reading it before. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Great, thank you. Fouad.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum. This is Fouad from Yemen. I am the livelihood and climate resilience specialist in Yemen. And I am interested to participate in this because my country is witnessing a displacement since 4,000 years, since the collapse of Marib Dam, and all Yemenis, they are spread in all the world. So it is very interesting also to be part of this workshop. Thank you.
Thank you, welcome. Alina?
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Alina Mayer. I'm the head of programs for IOM Jordan. IOM, for those that maybe don't know the acronym, we're the International Organization for Migration or the UN Migration Agency. Pleasure to be with you, of course, as in the title of the organization that I am affiliated with. We, of course, cover migration from all aspects, including climate change, of course, and the human mobility dimension of the climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ghada and Rula afterwards.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Ghada Ahmadin. I'm the program manager of RAID. RAID is the Arab Network for Environment and Development. And actually, today I'm representing also Dr. Ahmad Adli, who has a sudden, circumstances that he couldn't participate in today's meeting, and thank you so much for the invitation. Actually, RAID is a network of NGOs in the Arab region. It includes more than 300 NGOs from 17 Arab countries. And we are so much interested in climate change and human mobility, and we have been working on disaster risk reduction with many partners, especially the League of Arab States, the IOM, the NRC, and many others. And thank you so much for this invitation, and I'm sure the discussions will lead to more details. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Ruba and Suzanne?
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruba Al-Zuabi. I work for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK. I'm the Levant Region Climate, Energy and Environment Lead. And as many of you know, FCDO and the UK government is one of the major contributors to the humanitarian aid in Jordan, but also within the Levant, we have a huge interest in building climate resilience within refugee and host communities. So this is of huge interest to us. I'm also accompanied by other colleagues from FCDO. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And then, yeah, Suzanne, who might be having trouble with her mic, so hopefully she can speak. If not, please, just introduce yourself. You've already introduced yourself on the chat, environment and climate change expert. I'll give you a chance to speak, and then after Suzanne, if you don't manage, Sophia. And I think that's everybody.
Actually not.
Hello. Sorry.
Shall I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, my name is Rula Majdalani. I'm climate advisor at ICARDA. Prior to that, I have been the director of the Arab Center on Climate Change Policies at ESQA and the Division on Sustainable Management of Natural Resources, from where I have retired after 30 years of work at the UN. And I am also currently co-coordinating the MEDEC report on migration, climate, and conflict. So this is a subject that is very close to my heart, and I look forward to interacting during the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Rula. Welcome. And then Suzanne and Sophia, if you manage, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Finally, I was able to find a solution. Yeah, this is Sophia. I am the humanitarian advisor at the British Embassy. I work with Ruba. The main reason why I'm attending this, because climate is becoming the key of not just for the UK government, as well for the humanitarian sector, to ensure that the most vulnerable and marginalized group are not affected severely, because their ability to cope with climate change and challenges in terms of adapting with and trying to find source to live, with all the challenges they are facing, refugees and other vulnerable groups. It is necessary for us to have this dimension, or knowing more about climate. Over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne. Can you join?
Can you hear me now?
Great.
Great. Good morning to everyone. My name is Suzanne Al-Ajawi. I'm an independent expert in issues related to environment and climate change. At the time being, I'm working as an advisor for the Ministry of Environment, Water and Agriculture in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I've been dealing with a lot of issues related to climate change back home in Bahrain. I have, prior to my job here, at the time I was Director of Environmental Policies and Planning at the Ministry of Environment in Bahrain. I had been involved in a lot of projects related to climate change within the region, whether it's the GCC region or the Arab world. And right now, being part of my mandate at the ministry is dealing with issues related to environment and how it interacts with climate change and the relation between them. I am the author for the climate change chapter within the state of environment for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which will soon be published for the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome. And we have one final person who's just joined, so I'm going to put them straight into speaking. Dima, welcome. If you could just briefly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dima Abu Diab. I'm the head of UN Habitat office here in Jordan. I'm managing the office since 6 years, and we're managing also a couple of climate change related projects focusing on water scarcity and flood management. Nice to meet you all. I was supposed to come in person, but for some emergency cases, I could not join. Thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to have you. And with that, I hand back to the room. The mic is quite echoey, so if I could just ask everybody to speak as slowly and clearly as you can, and bring the mic as close as possible, so we can all hear you online. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, we can start. You have the mic. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Hope it's not too unbearable with the echo. My name is Matthew Moore. I'm a senior assessment officer for REACH, working on Yemen. I lead the displacement and CCCM team, and in terms of climate change, we're working a lot at the moment on flood preparedness and flood hazard mapping. It's obviously an increasing and great issue in Yemen. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fadi Ibrahim, and I work with Mr. Muhammad Asfour, and I'm glad to be part of this workshop today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. This is Mohammed Aida from Yemen, the Executive Director of the National Forum for Environment and Sustainable Development, and also on the SDG 7 regional focal point in the MENA region for the United Nations Major Group of Children and Youth. I'm really excited to be here with you guys. So it's time to discuss, not to talk about ourselves.
Hi, thanks everyone. My name is Liz Griesmer. I'm here on behalf of IOM Iraq. I work with the Displacement Tracking Matrix Unit. And in terms of climate research and data that we do, we're the main provider of information and the main source that's monitoring and tracking what we call climate-induced displacement, which we're observing in central and southern Iraq. And so we've produced a number of research outputs that are trying to look at the specific drivers of these movements. We're increasingly looking into climate vulnerability assessments of different parts of Iraq, and then understanding how climate change might be impacting the large protracted displacement caseload that we have in Iraq, causing, initial displacements, but also secondary displacements and field returns. So, thank you.
Hello, good morning. I'm Barbara McAllen. I'm DRC's Global Advisor on Housing, Land and Property. And my interest with climate overall specialist is precisely the relation between land, how land and housing actually are impacted by the effect of climate change, the disputes it creates, and the displacement.
Please make sure that the mic is very close to you.
Sure. It's like this? Perfect.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining us today. Really glad to be here. Fantastic conversation, I hope. I'm Fabio Sartori. I work for DRC as part of the climate team. I'm a global advisor for climate, environmental, and streaming. So basically, covering topics related to adaptation, mitigation, advocacy, and obviously the intersection between climate change, environmental degradation, and displacement in every country DRC operates. Thanks.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Samana Salimi. I'm the regional head of program for the Danish Refugee Council here in the Middle East, where we cover 6 countries. And I'm really happy that we're having this workshop, or MLC is back in this region. to look at, in particular, climate change and mobility and migration. As Lilo said, we are a displacement-focused organization, and it is likely that we are going to see more climate-induced displacements in this region, and it's also very much part of our strategy to look into this and how we program around that and look at climate adaptation more and more. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. I'm Safwan Bani Saleh. I'm a climate change studies specialist at the Royal Scientific Society.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Olivia Mason. I'm an academic researcher, so I work at university and primarily produce academic research, but I've been doing research in Jordan since 2015 on questions of mobility and climate change, including the growth of ecotourism here and also changing relationships between nomadic communities and the environment, and projects such as nature reserves in Jordan, their impact on rural communities.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Maria Street. I work for the ICRC, the International Red Cross. I'm the regional advisor for question of internal displacement and migration. And end of last year, in partnership with the Norwegian Red Cross and also with the assistance of the Red Cross represents Climate Center, we produced a paper, one publication actually, called Making Adaptation Work. And it addressed the compounding impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and conflict in many regions.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure meeting all of you. I'm Ayesha Farid Al-Habitat. I'm the program officer, and I've also been working on several projects related to climate change and mobility in general.
Everyone, good morning. I'm so happy to be here. I am Amir Faisal Shana. I'm from Yemen, and I worked as a defense contact point for 2 years in a row, and I've been working with the UNHCR as a senior CDP assistant. And that's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. My name is Lucy Hoville. My background is in migration. I've worked in quite a lot of places around the world over the last 25 years or so for both civil society, but also for different governments and UN agencies. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lucy. I think we will start now. Yeah. Stopped working. See? Stop. No, I put it closer. I can't put it closer than this. Good. It's not working. Then let me try that out. Maybe it's not working. Is this better? Yes. Excellent. So I'm Mohammed Asfour. I worked with Dr. Lucy on this report as a climate expert. I've been working in the field for many years. I led several networks within the Middle East and Africa. In this regard, several campaigns, and sat on the Royal Committee that developed the new economic vision, especially when it came to green economy and climate change. Let's start maybe with the next slide, please. Okay. Maybe I can start with this image here you see in front of you. So this is a photo of a dead olive tree I took in Azraq. And I believe we might have passed by this when we were there. Azraq is a very important oasis in the middle of the desert. And this is why during the years, immigrants from all over the region, and even from the Caucasus, came to benefit from the situation. However, as a result of years of mismanagement, the oasis dried up. And this is an example of how this impacted people's lives, and we will be focusing a little bit more on how agriculture is so relevant to our type of work. So just so that you have a clear idea of the region we are focusing on, it is the Arabian Peninsula, Mesopotamia, and Iran. The reason why Africa is not included in our research is because NMC already did a report on Africa, and this is why it was excluded. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll turn now to Dr. Lucy so that she tells us more about what we've done.
Great, thank you. We're doing a bit of a tag team effort, so you don't get sick of either of our voices. Just to check online, can you hear okay?
And can you see?
And can you see?
Yes, it's good now.
Yes.
The slides weren't working,
Yes.
but it's good now.
Okay, if you can't hear,
Much better.
feel free to just shout out and we won't be insulted. So for this study, our methodology was really twofold. We did a quite substantive literature review of everything that we could lay our hands on that was relevant to both climate change impacts in the Middle East, but also to migration. And then we tried to bring those two things together. There was less literature that combined those two, but we tried to cover as much as we could. We looked at 155 different pieces of work altogether and 22 data sources. But then to kind of sense check what we were finding as we went along, we also did 15 interviews with a number of key informants, some of whom are with us today. Thank you very, very much. And just to kind of allow us to try out some of the ideas and some of the things we were finding as we were going along. We then also had the opportunity to do 3 focus group discussions at a workshop happening here in Jordan, looking at cities and urban areas. So that was the sort of core methodology that we used. We then analysed this both geographically and thematically and brought it together into the report. So next slide. Just to give a quick overview of the report, which is also an overview of how we're going to present this. The first section is really looking at climate change impacts. I'm sorry, it's quite hard to see. I don't know if we can turn the lights. Can you see okay? Okay. Placing it in its historical context, I think we're very good at pretending that migration started yesterday rather than it's something that's been relevant for centuries. Looking at the impact at regional, national and community level, and then looking at its relation to particularly heat and water resources. And then the second section is really looking at mobility and then immobility in the region. And we've broken this down into 4 categories, if you like, and I'm going to explain that later, so don't get too worried right now, but just looking at forced mobility, voluntary mobility, forced immobility, and voluntary immobility. But as I said, we'll come back to explaining the logic behind that. And then we bring that together into a series of key findings where we bring the kind of climate, if you like, literature and together with the migration literature and try and make sense of it together. And then part of the sort of driver behind this was to think about potential case studies where, or hotspots, if you like, that could use further research. So we then outlined 6 different areas, and that will be the subject of our second sort of breakout sessions. So let me hand back to Mohammed, who will talk about the climate change impacts.
Thank you. So where did this come from, the historical context? As I mentioned, I roam the desert in Jordan and the region, and on one occasion I saw a carving of a cow that got extinct in the 17th century in Poland. So what would an image of a cow that lived in Europe do in the heart of Saudi Arabia? This tells us that climate has changed even within the past 15,000 years. So this was from a book that was recently published on the relationship between climate change and the region. And it tells us that there were 9 significant climatic changes within the Middle East since the end of the last ice age. The last one here is the Little Ice Age, and we could correlate the relationship between these changes and the rise and fall of many civilizations and many inventions as well. So for example, if we look at the Little Ice Age and you compare it to the history of the Ottoman Empire, you find many links between both. So this is why we thought we would start from here, and there's more about this in the report. It also contributed to many inventions in Mesopotamia and so on. So it was good to look at it from a historical perspective. However, Next, please. And I'll read this from a World Bank report. It says that one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change during extremely high temperatures, desertification, water scarcity, degraded marine and coastal ecosystems, and high levels of air pollution is this region. So when we speak about the Middle East and we discuss climate change, we do not compare it to other regions, but perceive it as something where climate change is really causing problems. According to a NASA report, by 2050, many parts of the Arabian Peninsula would not be suitable for human life. In the report, we share a few maps of the impacts we envisage or that are envisaged and are related to climate change. Next, please. And I'll give a few examples here. So we expect extreme temperatures. How would that impact people or affect them? We will see recurrent power blackouts, and we saw that in Iraq when temperatures had risen to great levels. It affects labor productivity. So we talk about economic development, but again, with climate change, it will bring the labor productivity down. It will affect agriculture, and it's already doing so. Then sandstorms and its impacts on health. Some of the GCC countries have the highest pollution levels in the world, and part of it is attributed to the small sand particles that could seep into your bloodstream. Of course, they also affect tourism, and tourism has become a main economic activity. Sea level rise that we will see around the region. Then we've got water resources, and I think for Jordan, for example, this is the biggest challenge that it is facing and will face in the future, which relates to the sustainability of lands, food security, ecosystems, and will cause boundary water basin issues between countries in the region, which might impact conflict and stability. It will affect economic activity because we all depend on water. Then this is too small.
Yeah. Let's maybe try to fix it.
Can you read this word for me?
Forest fires.
Forest fires. And we saw that in Lebanon, how it affected agriculture and it affected tourism. And it is said or debated that it also instigated some of the protests that occurred after storms and cyclones, and we just saw one in the GCC, which caused havoc, and many attribute to climate change. Next, please. So how prepared is this region for climate change? At the center of the climate change challenges is governance. Now, we know through the Odesk review we conducted that the issue of climate change had been neglected for many years, and thus the governance structures that would support adaptation were not put in place. Add to that, we know too that civil society within this region is not active, and generally and internationally, civil society had a great role to play in advocating for change that would result in more climate change friendly policies and would help create more outreach and awareness. There's also the issue of inequality, and we'll be speaking a little bit more about it when we go to the findings, so I'll jump. And all of this is related to conflict. Now, there's a big debate about the relationship between some of the existing conflicts in the region and climate change, but some argue that there is a direct relationship. So it's a two-way relationship. Conflict causes countries that have conflicts not to be able to adapt well to climatic challenges, and it's argued, as well as I mentioned, that it has also a direct relationship. I think I'll move to you, Dr. Lucy, for the next section.
Okay. Thank you. Do you want to try and see? We're going to just try and see if we can switch the, maybe go on to the next slide in the meantime, and I'll talk about it a bit, because this is really hard to see now. But just in terms of an overview of mobility in the region, I think it's really important to set the context and to understand that when we're thinking about climate, it is in this broader context of the fact that there are significant conflicts in the region that have led to quite significant levels of displacement. But also against the fact that people have always moved. And I think this was when you think about it in its historical context, people have always moved, and it's where they've moved, where the boundaries, borders have had meaning. Obviously, we know that the imposition of colonial boundaries changed the nature of movement, but the fact remains that movement has always happened. But this increase in forced migration has been quite significant over the recent years. So this first pie chart are the numbers of IDPs in the region, obviously very high for Syria, Yemen, Iraq, and Iran as well. And then that second pie chart represents the numbers of refugees in the different countries of the region. And as everyone in Jordan is acutely aware, those numbers are really high in this country. But I think it's really important to emphasize, broadly speaking, most people stay in their country of origin, possibly in their region of origin, and very seldom do they move outside of the region. We'll return to this later, but we know that that movement outside of the region has a disproportionate policy impact with a very strong Western-centric approach to responding to some of these things. So I said that I would explain the four categories. This was a model that our Mixed Migration Centre has begun to develop around just thinking about a sort of conceptual framework for thinking, excuse me, about climate-induced mobility. And it's really to think about how both climate-related stressors and existing adaptation strategies either feed into someone's aspiration to migrate and or their capability to migrate. And so it's really just trying to understand what existing mobility patterns there are already. Do people have the capability to stay where they are or not? And then thinking about what other adaptation strategies people have, which leads to these four categories, which I've slightly changed the order of, but we'll go through each of those in turn. So just thinking about forced mobility, this is obviously something we're all acutely aware of. Over 11 million registered refugees in the region, over 12 million IDPs. And as I said, conflict is a dominant factor, and we mustn't forget that. So where does the role of climate and environmental factors feed into this, as both a driver of movement and as a factor in displacement? And I think this is a really good question. It is indisputable that it is having an impact. I don't think there's a significant amount of empirical data that indicates exactly where that fits, and maybe that's very difficult data to get. And there are a couple of examples there's just two examples that came through the literature. The first is the media in Iran reported 42,000 people forced to migrate due to, they identified climate change as the main driver in 2022. Of course, that figure was probably a lot higher. And then in Iraq, IOM has estimated that nearly 62,000 families live in places where climate-induced displacement is taking place, and 1 in 4 households are living in locations where at least 20% of the original population has already left. These are really high statistics. So then thinking a bit about voluntary mobility. So this is people moving out of choice, if you like. And obviously, a lot of this is not new. People have moved, particularly from urban areas to rural areas to urban areas for as long as urban areas have existed. This is nothing new, but it seems that this is definitely on the increase. Then there's the pull of labour opportunities in the Gulf Cooperation countries. This is a very strong pull for labour. And then movement outside of the GCCs for the very wealthy who want to escape the heat. Small numbers, but still significant. And then there's irregular migration out of the region. As I said, small numbers, but big policy impact. And the impact of climatic environmental factors on migrant workers, and this is a huge issue. One of the more shocking reports was of Nepalese migrant workers before the World Cup who've returned to Nepal, and there is a massive increase in kidney disease because they were forced to work in such heat, and now they've overwhelmed the hospitals in Nepal, the young men who have been sent to earn money for their families. And so that's just one example of the sort of environmental and climatic impact on migrants. So forced immobility, this is impossible to quantify. I don't think we would ever be able to quantify this, but it is incredibly important to have it on our radar. Obviously, you can't count those who don't move, who can't move. That would never happen. But it is very likely that there are people whose resources have been so depleted that even if they need to move, the cost of moving is so high that it becomes almost impossible. I think, obviously, moving is a risk. It costs money, and people need to have the right networks in place. It's a very complex, movement is always highly complex. And of course, there are always multiple factors that might lead to someone moving. But I think it's really important from a policy perspective that we constantly bear in mind populations who are staying, but for whom staying is no longer viable. And I think one of the populations that really came through in the study was protracted displaced populations. I mean, people who've been in displacement for maybe over 5 years. And we know that the utter failure globally to find durable solutions to forced displacement has led to significant numbers of refugees and IDPs being left in semi-permanent states of displacement. And this is a really significant problem. It's a global problem. It's a failure in responsibility sharing. And so, for instance, there are many examples. Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, they can't return home. Maybe a few are returning to Syria, but maybe that's not necessarily a choice, if you like. It's because it's the least bad option. But their resources are constantly maybe being depleted. That's not the full picture. There are plenty of people who are obviously living in this country in exile, and they're making a very good living, but there are also many who are not. Their options for onward movement are incredibly limited. We know resettlement places are painfully low. And then likewise, IDPs in Yemen and Iraq, living in informal settlements, often living in really suboptimal locations. We heard from Yemen that when people moved, they maybe had 2 or 3 children. Now they have a lot more. If they were to go back, would that land actually be able to meet the needs of their families? So these are all really big issues. Thanks, Mohammed. And then voluntary immobility. So people don't want to move most of the time. People want to stay where they are. They want to stay with their families and with their communities. This is really important. And I mean, there are definitely generational aspects to this that overlay all of what I'm talking about. And good to hear that we've got someone who's really thinking about where the youth population fits into all of this. But we really need policies that foster adaptation and resilience, that allow people to choose to stay, rather than waiting for someone to be forced out of their home and then suddenly we all realise that there's a problem. And then, of course, at the end of the day, these factors are all interlinked. It's all very well to have a model and to give everything a category, but we know that actually it's really, really complex, and that the overlap between them is really strong. So let me hand back to Mohammed now, who's going to go through some of our key findings.
Thank you, Dr. Lucy. So we came up with 6 main findings that you'll find in the report. The first is that while the study establishes a clear relationship between human mobility and immobility and the impacts of climate change, the challenge is to understand the impacts of climate change on mobility in relation to other factors. So it is related, but to which extent and in which area and so on, this needs further research. Second is that the degree of impact that climate change has on mobility or immobility can vary from one situation to another, depending on a range of factors, such as the intensity of climatic variability and extremes, their longevity, and the prevailing level of resilience and preparedness within a certain region. And if we go back to the point on inequalities, we find that a lot of the richer countries within the region are more capable of adapting, while those driven by conflict have to face a lot of the consequences of climate change. Third, in cases of climate variability and extremes, people across the Middle East often prefer to stay within homes and communities. It's not like they just are killing themselves to leave, as the impression we usually get. People this is a socially knit community, and unless their livelihoods are affected, they like to stay where they are. Good. 3 minutes? Good, I'll finish. Fourth, for those who do move, the vast majority stay within their country of origin. So we've seen people migrate due to the consequences or impacts of climate change, but when they do so, they perhaps go from a rural agricultural area to the city or so on. Fifth, at a national level, climate adaptation does not appear to score high on Middle Eastern government priority lists, even in more prosperous countries that have the resources to act. And as an example, only 2 countries within the region, Palestine and Kuwait, have national climate adaptation plans that have been approved. Sixth is that inequalities in the region are stark. We spoke a lot about this, both between countries, but also within countries. Dr. Lucy spoke about migrant workers. So within the same country, you find stark inequalities. Finished? I think let's say 3 minutes are fine. Okay, good. I forgot this, so no, 1 Okay, so as part of the report as well, we've highlighted 6 hotspots that need further research. I think Dr. Lucy touched upon the issue of the return of Syrian refugees from Jordan and what that implies. Yemen is also a hotspot in our opinion, where about 4 million people have become internally displaced over the past 10 years. One example here is if you migrate from an agricultural community, you would have had a piece of land to sustain you. How will that piece of land be affected by climate change? And what about property? When you left 10 years ago, you only had a family of 3, now you might even have grandchildren. Iraq's marshlands is a hot topic too, and has witnessed a lot of change, although it has been home for civilization for more than 5,000 years. Labor migration, GCC countries, Gaza, even without the recent conflict, housed about 2.1 million people, only 4% of them had access to water, or that is a word for water, safe water. Then Al-Bidun, hundreds of thousands, mainly in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. These are people who do not have passport and thus do not get the benefits other citizens might receive. So how will they deal with changing climatic conditions in the future? So I think that's it for this motion.
Great, thank you. So we'll come back to those so-called hotspots in the second session. But what we thought we would do now is this next session is really to begin to break out and discuss some of these things in our groups. But we thought we'd do, first of all, just 15 minutes, if that's okay, of initial questions, Q&A. It doesn't have to be that this is the only opportunity for you to grill us on this report and challenge us on it. But it'd be good to just get maybe one round of questions from the room and one round of questions from the online participants. So, yeah.
I can thank you. Any questions from the first table? Yes. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Liz Griesmer from Iowa Morale. I think this point on the preference to stay and mobility being, largely inter-country and then where it does occur outside the country, inter-regional is important. But I do wonder about if there could be maybe a part 2 or an inclusion within this report of how government policies both within the region and outside the region might be influencing mobility patterns, specifically in relation to climate change, but also more broadly. So, I don't think it comes as a surprise to say that, these legal regular pathways have become increasingly restricted. And so how has that impacted the options for people is, to what extent might it be the sort of economic impacts of climate change causing these more localized movements, and to what extent is it just a reflection of the possibilities for people, the capabilities they have to move outside the region? So this.
Thanks a lot. Would you like to answer now or
Let's
take
keep
it?
going.
Okay.
Yeah, hi everyone. First of all, thanks a lot. Fantastic work. Fabian from DRC. A few questions, just some reflections, because I guess the best thing of this report is how it triggers questions, right, and conversations. So one thing is maybe for further steps in the research, how the impact of climate change compounds with environmental degradation, especially in specific issues such as water scarcity, because at the same time that we are seeing desertification and all this process due to climate change, we also have depletion of natural resources. And it seems that a lot of these movements are related to livelihoods. So I guess this depletion and further disputes over natural resources will directly impact livelihood opportunities. Also related to policies and how governments are dealing with it, I wonder if the lack of better resolutions in terms of a supported legal process of mobility isn't related to generating a more affordable, let's say, workforce in certain countries that have interest on welcoming not refugees necessarily, but a cheap workforce, for example, and how this affects policies as well. There's also a minor detail, let's say, on this brief that we have, because we're always mentioning that how climate change will affect existing mobility dynamics. And my feeling is that will is a tricky word, because for readers might give the impression that it's something to come. And actually what we're seeing with the findings is that this is happening for decades already, right? So I would reflect on the use of this term more specifically. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
I'm Olivia Mason from Macquarie University. Yeah, thanks both for the report. It's interesting to read. So a lot of the research that I've done has been speaking with communities themselves. So it's interesting to read perhaps from the perspective of those making the change. And I think this is a key issue as well, that how communities themselves might understand climate change might be different to how it's understood at a level, but also that often the communities who are most impacted by these decisions are either most impacted by climate change are either those who are blamed for land degradation, worse climate change, they're seen as the problem, or they have very, very little say in environmental governance as well. So climate change as well can lead often to what I see as communities feeling more marginalised as well. Because they often feel that they have very little say, that they are those who are the problem, but also that their livelihoods are the most connected to it, and they're the communities who are most vulnerable at risk as well. And I think that that's a tension as well that links to some of these wider issues around conflict as well, how communities kind of feel connected to place, how they feel that they're being listened to within these different narratives as well.
Yeah, comment.
Question, and thanks again for the report and the presentation. So Nadia Smith from the ICRC, and my comment or question jumps at the previous comments and the first question, because looking not only in policies and how they can influence the mobility or rather the mobility of some communities, but also the impact of conflict, because based on Monday, we dived in on that question, and indeed one of our conclusions relates to how austerities and conflict really can prevent from even within their own countries.
Yes, that's a very important point. Any questions from this table? Okay, maybe you can comment on the migration part, and I'll then add something regarding climate change.
Thanks, Mohammed. Really helpful. Thank you. I think this idea around policies around preference to stay is really, really important. So I think there's definitely a need for more awareness building and advocacy around that. I'll let Mohammed say a bit more about that. But I think the issue around environmental degradation absolutely is really, really, really important. We do mention it in the report, but it's definitely not the focus, and I agree that's important. This using the term will rather than is completely, I agree, we need to change that. It is happening. And I think it's really, really important that we don't give the impression that this is, as you say, something in the future, it's something in the present. And then again, this issue of the communities, and I think one of the things that was really striking as we went through the literature is there are very few empirical studies at a community level that try to unpack these issues. And I think that's where the real gaps in research lie at the moment. It's that granular understanding of how people are looking at these multiple different factors. And I think it's so interesting. Obviously, we're constantly, as we've made evident with our own presentation, trying to squeeze people who move into categories. But how do people themselves make sense of all of this? And where isn't it helpful to think about the role of conflict vis-a-vis climate, or how these things fit together? How do communities themselves understand that very, very complex interaction? And I think until we have that really, if you like, grassroots perspective, we'll be very impoverished in our sort of wider global, regional, national conversations on this subject. So I think it's really worth us asking the question about where it is and it isn't helpful to tease apart, if you like, different drivers. Where does that make sense and where does it not make sense? And I think just circling back to the original point, I think what we need is a policy structure that both opens up opportunities for mobility. I agree, legal pathways are so limited. We need to open up those pathways for moving, and we need to open up, if you like, pathways for staying. And it's sort of balancing these two things alongside each other that's really, really important. So Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start with Olivia's question about communities, and I think this is very important, and it's part of the point on governance. And this reminded me of some research we did for Plan International on this project. So it interviewed about 181 people and youth, maybe between 16 and 35, if I'm not mistaken. So when we asked them, how much do you think you know enough about climate change? Over 90% said yes. Then we asked them, are you doing enough to address climate change? Less than 10% said yes. So there's a big gap between knowledge and action. And this could be attributed to several factors, but one of them is the empowerment of communities and for them to feel that they own their decision. Now, the other point, Fabian, you mentioned, I think there are many factors that are all intermingled, and we try to address in the report, especially in terms of mismanagement of natural resources. And I like to use some historic evidence. So I was in a place called Shobak in southern Jordan, and you could go to the area and it's all terraced. There was, I was invited by an Italian PhD student to show me the excavation site. And there was an olive oil press. And this was during the Mamluki or Ayyubi period, which is about 700 years ago. So within 700 years, there was so much degradation in the ecosystem that an area that had olive orchards is now barren. So it's not just climate change, it is mismanagement of natural resources and so on. So and this is one of the challenges, is how do we separate the different contributors to the crisis? I think we've taken enough time. I can see Wasim.
Yeah, let's move on to the people online.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, we've got 2 hands raised online. Fouad, would you like to speak first? And then Ruba, and then Rula.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this is Fouad from Yemen again. In the last presentation and also in the report, I saw that only 2 countries developed a national adaptation program action plan for climate change, but also Yemen have developed it in 2009, and it was submitted also to the Climate Change also Center. So please check again. And I think, and I know that it is dependent on the reference, but I wanted to correct this issue. Thank you.
Okay, I think we noted this, and I'll let the others respond later. Ruba?
Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation. 2 main points, I think. One is, I think it's very crucial to distinguish between across-the-board displacement caused by conflicts and the within the border sort of climate mobility or immobility, as you call it. So I think it would be nice to know how did you approach these 2 dimensions of displacement or mobility. Since these are quite complex, when you add all the other factors to them, including climate and livelihoods and water and inclusion and so on. So is there a recommendation on how such a multidimensional framework could be developed, whether there would be some sort of a matrix or a model that could help in the planning of response? The second point is around the policy review that you have mentioned. It's very interesting because we know Jordan has a national adaptation plan, but when Mohammed said approved, I assume that they're also looking for official approvals somehow. So I think it would be good to clarify what you mean by that, because as the colleague from Yemen said, I think there are countries that have already developed their own NAPs. Related to that, I think the policy review would be more useful if it also includes other important policies related to humanitarian response and to social protection, to addressing the most vulnerable sort of social development related policies, because I think on one hand there is the mentioning of adaptation in environmental policies, which is one dimension important, but just one. And then there is the other important one, which is how is climate mainstreamed within other policies such as social protection, because when we talk about climate mobility, it is definitely influenced by extreme weather conditions, by floods, by heat waves, by droughts, and the most vulnerable are the ones that we're talking about. So how is that somehow covered or not covered sufficiently in other policies, the non-environmental ones? Thank you.
Thanks, Ruba. Rula, for the last comment, because we need to move on. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to build on Ruba's comment, and I think that you have captured well the complexity of what does it mean in terms of within the country as opposed to external, and also showing and deconstructing stereotypes and perceptions that people just want to pack their bags and leave, and this is not the case. And I would add to that maybe one dimension that you may want to look at is communities pooling their resources to send one member abroad, and it's usually young males, sometimes females, and so it's really adding a drain on these communities to pool their resources so that they can get enough money for the illegal migration. And it is creating, and to what extent, maybe this is for the study, but also for later research, for the knowledge gap, how restrictive policies are pushing for an emerging class and mushrooming groups of smugglers who are working on these routes of illegal migration, which are perceived especially in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and those who particularly take the sea routes. One thing I maybe related to what are the possible solutions, maybe one thing that is I would recommend to add, what are the models that we have now in place in terms of dealing with massive or a large number of immigrants? It's definitely not motivated in the same way. I think there is a lot to learn from these models. How are not just even within European countries, they differ. How are they dealing with immigrants as opposed to countries like Lebanon, like Egypt, like Jordan? How are we dealing, or Cyprus, or Greece? It really is an entry point to understanding and developing the right kind of policy, because there is so much you can do with adaptation. Honestly, I have worked a lot in adaptation, and there is really a capacity, and it is, as long as you have more conflict, it is eroding this adaptive capacity. So yes, there has to be definitely that adaptive capacity, but one needs to go a step further and advise at global level and at international policy level. And there are so many fora for bringing this type of like really the complexity of information that you brought in, whether you're doing in the high-level political forum, in the COP process, in so many processes, showing that complexity. Because, and this is why I really like that study, because I have seen a kind of like showing the dynamics, and showing that it differs from one place to another, and showing that it deconstructs stereotypes, whereas you see climate migrants everywhere. Why can't we call it from our region just climate migrants? There are a lot of nuances to be addressed in that, and there are also a lot of pitfalls to just look at migration, movement, displacement from a climate perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ruller. I'll just respond to Ruba's point regarding national action plans. Now, our source of information was the UNFCCC website. Our research tells us that many countries are working on their national adaptation plans. Even Yemen started doing work regarding their plan prior to the conflict. There is activity in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Jordan, other countries, but we used the UNFCCC website as a reference. So that's why.
Yeah, but I think, and yeah, we're going to nuance that a little in the report and explain it a bit more clearly, because it's clearly something that's quite controversial. So, and then thinking about this issue, I think the idea of a multi-dimensional framework or matrix, I think it's a really, really important one and a really good one. And I think it would be so interesting, while recognising the limitations of if you like, this sort of pigeonholing that would create this sort of multi-dimensional approach that I think is so important. And I think that's a really important idea. And then the issue around other policies, I think this is absolutely right. It's very hard to actually tease all of this apart, and there are very few policies that don't have a bearing on this. And this returns again to the final point around sort of what are the good examples of how the models, if you like, in migration. And I think we need to look at, there's a lot of work going on in sort of cities and urban areas, and thinking about what is going on there, what is the thinking, and where do we need to be putting more investment into that with this huge issue around urbanisation. I think that's a really important factor. And then this idea of needing to deconstruct perceptions of people wanting to leave, and the pooling of resources. This is such a big issue. My own opinion is that people smugglers fill the gap left by poor policy making. And so I think we need to shift our attention away from people smugglers and onto both global and regional policy making in this space, because otherwise we won't ever solve this problem. And so I think that where these failures are happening, we need to pinpoint them and understand them and figure out where we need to have the evidence for really good, strong advocacy in this space. So I will leave it at that. Sorry to not allow for another round of questions, but as I say, please continue to ask questions and criticise the report as you go along, because it's really helpful for us. But we're going to split up now into 3 groups in this room and 1 group online. And the sort of idea, can you go to the next?
Yes, this is the session.
Yeah, so I have to come a bit closer, sorry. We've just thought these are some guiding questions, and this is sort of thinking initially about where issues of mobility and immobility, if you like, intersect with some of the climate issues we've been talking about. As I say, the following session will look more at the hotspots, if you like, but I imagine that will begin to be part of the conversation. So these are 4 guiding questions, but please don't feel that you have to stick to them religiously. But first of all, what are the key issues related to climate change impacts on mobility in the Middle East? And again, what's really helpful in this room is that you all come with your own specialisation, whether it's geographical or thematic or a combination of the 2. So this gives us a really good, if you like, stress testing of what we've been writing. Climate change impacts acting more as a driver of migration to the Middle East from elsewhere or within. Just, what are your ideas around the nature of that movement? How about the vulnerability of existing migrants, refugees and IDPs to climate change impacts? Where does this fit in among priorities for action? And finally, among these challenges, what is specific to the Middle East which requires consideration and investigation? These are huge questions. We're giving you 30 minutes to resolve all of this. What I would request is that in each table you have someone who's happy to take notes, and someone who would then be happy to present back to the group. We're running a little bit late, but if we maybe take 25 minutes, and then if you can come back with a view to giving just a 2-minute overview of what your group found. Tough call, but that would be amazing. If this middle group finds it's too noisy, there is another table over there, so you're really welcome to relocate to over there. But if you're happy to stay on your tables, then yeah, brilliant. So we'll call you back in 25 minutes.
And you can choose between that table or that table.
Oh, are we just doing 2 groups?
Yes.
2 groups?
Yes.
To everybody online, I'm going to put you in 2 different breakout rooms. I'm hoping it's going to work. 25 minutes to discuss. Please find someone to restitute and report back to the group, and we'll see you at 10:50. Let's hope it works. Shout at me if there's an issue. Okay?
Thank you.
We noted, of course, water scarcity, reduction in agricultural productivity. In the case of Yemen, we had some interesting discussion on situations of forced mobility, where people are unable to move because of the conflict, but are nevertheless being impacted by climactic factors. So yes, it could be interesting to explore in that report. Food security is an issue. I think there's questions of, in the context of all of this conflict, where's the political will to address these issues? Of course, there's a large IDP caseload and migrant populations within the region, and the relative impacts of climate change on these groups. And then specifically, I think one big issue is the reception of people in these urban areas. So people are often living in informal areas on the periphery of cities, and in some cases, people might displace due to climactic factors into greater climactic vulnerability due to moving into a flood-prone area, for example. So I think this is an issue both in terms of living standards, but at the same time in terms of government policy, sort of addressing. Because I think, at least in the case of Iraq, there's a certain reluctance to accept that these inflows will be continuing and are going to increase, and to have a corresponding urbanization policy that secures their living standards and needs. And instead, there's a preference to, or an expectation that they will return when climactic conditions improve. There's also questions of a need to diversify livelihoods away maybe from more of the climate sensitive ones. There's questions of increased protection risks, especially as we put in climate change, increasing risks of TB for and to question to our climate change impacts acting more as a driver to the Middle East from elsewhere within. I think it's fairly clear that it's from within. I think there's a variety of reasons, as mentioned, costs, networks, but also, of course, government policy at a national level and then at the international level are all shaping these movements. There was mention, though, I think this is quite interesting, of international migration potentially from EHA to Yemen, and the extent to which this might be influenced by climate change. So this would be inter-regional, and I think.
From where to where? From Horn of Africa, yes, okay.
So I think this could be interesting. In the case of Iraq, I'm not necessarily sure we're seeing inter-regional movement that can link to climate change, but it might be coexisting as one factor among many that is driving international or inter-regional migration. And then I think to this point, we highlighted that existing migrants, refugees, and refugees may be the most vulnerable because they're living in substandard housing, because their living conditions are not secure, but this is a relatively neglected issue. Especially when we talk about climate change and mobility, there's a focus on the movement itself and not on people who have already moved to make the experience of these impacts as a result. In terms of what is specific to the Middle East, I think there's definitely a need for further research into the relationships between conflict, climate, and mobility. I think it's highly context specific and quite complex, so there needs to be greater focus on this. I think other issues specific to the Middle East are the ability to adapt to these challenges. Of course, issues of water scarcity, temperature, and environmental degradation. There's a need for governments to receive financial support, and the need to engage youth. So I'll leave it there.
And who's your reporter?
Okay, so for the first question, we started by just talking about some of the kind of environmental, the kind of extreme temperatures, flash floods, earthquakes, desertification, water scarcity. And with extreme temperatures, we discussed the fact that it's not just high temperatures, it's also very cold temperatures as well that can create a lot of problems, especially for crop management. But also that we need to think about extreme temperatures as linked to health as well. And who's having to work in these conditions, who's being exposed most often to these extreme temperatures, changes in climate. Also that often there's who's doing these different practices. So there's large scale extraction happening, perhaps by selling off land and resources to large multinational companies, who are not often then kind of seen as the blame and they're the drivers, but that also creates tensions within communities themselves when they see that happening, and they feel that resources are being sold as environmentally damaging practices are happening by selling land in a global capitalist. Also a feeling that there is often traditional knowledge is not valued. There's no mechanisms for that to be valued, and that connects as well to governance as well. Who makes decisions? How is governance made equal across different scales? We then question one moved into question 4. So we also discussed that there's a lot of that there's a feeling that there's a lot of national strategies, there's a lot of action plans for climate change, but the challenge is actually implementation, that there's very few mechanisms to actually implement these practices. We can't just keep producing more and more strategies or action plans without the means of implementing them and implementing them in a fair and equitable, transparent way as well within these. So that's where it's needed. And again, a disconnect between state and local policies or strategies that are produced at state level, those are produced within the communities, with the communities. We also discussed land ownership, land tenure, who has the right to land. Do people feel they have the right to own land, they're able to own land? That also leads to people thinking for the future. If people don't feel they're going to be displaced soon, if people feel that they don't have any way of owning land, it's going to be taken away, then they don't feel that they want to do things in an environmentally friendly way or climate way. Whether people feel they have a future in that place, they feel a sense that is going to. And then we talked about it about pastoralism as something that maybe is not just in the Middle East region, but it's definitely something that is highly prevalent in terms of mobile pastoralism, particularly. And what are the impacts on that? What are strategies to support those living in nomadic lifestyles? Then, yeah, we said the same with the first table, we said that it's mostly within the region itself. And it's often difficult to understand climate change because it's attributed to so many different factors. So to actually say climate change here is the reason becomes really difficult. And I think that also connects to understanding what languages are being used by different communities to understand climate change. If we're using a global language of climate change, that might not be understood at a local level as what we might see. And the displacement just contributes. And often we see problems just being moved into cities. That's something that was kind of discussed around. Is there anything? Yeah. Okay.
Thanks a lot. We move to the online sessions, breakout sessions. Jane?
Great. This is not me. I'm going to have to hand straight over to our nominated interveners.
I can start if you don't mind. Shall I?
Yes, please go ahead.
Well, okay, thanks so much. For the first question, so we've talked about, in fact, three main issues. We've talked about water, quality and quantity, and we discussed the impacts of water scarcity on mobility by limiting access to clean water, drinking water, increasing competition for resources, and this would, potentially enhance migration from different areas. And we've talked about as well extreme weather events, one of the main issues, and extreme events, heat waves, droughts, storms, and the flooding. These are issues that would enhance migration, and I believe that's it. And we've mentioned the complexity of these issues. It is like the interrelation between all of these impacts, and it would cascading down to other factors and to other sectors. So this is regarding the first one, the first question. The second question. So in fact, we believe that it works both ways. So it would enhance migration to the Middle East from elsewhere, and it would enhance internal migration within the Middle East. So climate change will enhance migration to Middle East, as I mentioned, from elsewhere, from South Asia, where areas that are vulnerable to droughts, floods, and sea level rise. and internal migration within the Middle East. Water scarcity, floods, extreme events would induce migration within the Middle East, within the same country, or within across countries, across borders. So this is the second question. The third one regarding what was the third one? Sorry. The third one, how about the vulnerability of existing migrants, refugees to climate change impacts? I don't think we discussed this thoroughly, but we talked about that migrants and refugees, they are vulnerable by themselves. So climate change would compound this, would increase this vulnerability. And the last question about the challenges, in fact, we highlighted one main challenge, which is conflict and war. This was one of the main challenge that is being encountered here in the Middle East, so that we need to consider. That's all from our side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Al-Muayyad. Appreciate the fact that you are with us today. Is there another group online, Jane? Or just one? No, two.
No, there's two groups.
Okay. Who will be presenting next?
Fuad has his hand up. I'm not sure if he's intervening or speaking.
No, just speak. I wanted to complete what Muayyad said, but let's wait for the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Fuad, actually, the group nominated you, Fuad, to speak on our behalf. Is that okay with you?
It's difficult for me to express all the ideas of you. Yeah.
Okay, so this leave you with me only. So let me try to summarize what our group has discussed. Not much as answers to each question, but rather than exchanging views on the priorities related to the topic. So we all agreed that this is a very important topic, that it needs to be further investigated and highlighted in the Middle East and within each country. We spoke about improper management of natural resources, especially water, as a key issue and a driver not only for migration and displacement, but also for conflicts. We spoke about floods and the lack of techniques to manage water. We spoke about infrastructure destruction and impacts on agriculture and livelihoods. We spoke about the lack of data in general, but more specifically related to climate mobility and the need for more evidence-based planning. So data evidence needed to inform policies and plans. We spoke about the need for policy streamlining and coordination across sectors. This is not just a climate standalone thing. We also talked about the need to differentiate the way we address internal versus cross-border mobility, as they have different needs to cater for. We spoke about the importance of linking this to socioeconomic impacts, especially when it comes to people migrating from rural areas to cities, jobs to be secured, services, housing, and many other services that governments find themselves unable to provide to the increasing population in urban areas. So workforce-related issues. So the socioeconomic lens is really important. I hope that I covered most of the topics we spoke about.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Ruba. And again, happy that you were able to join us today. I think now we will take a coffee break.
Yeah, sorry, I know I promised 30 minutes, but it's gonna be a bit shorter. So yeah, we have a coffee break until 11:30. Yeah.
Okay, so see you again in 20 minutes.
And for online people, enjoy your beverages.
Across different sites of Jordan, bearing in mind, of course, that most refugees are not in camps, they're in urban areas. And then what is the impact of climate on their quality of life? What are the factors that influence decision-making in this space, whether it's staying in Jordan or returning to Syria or thinking about moving elsewhere? And what are some of the climate considerations that interact with this decision-making? So really also thinking about when people, if and when people are thinking about return to Syria as well, what are they thinking about in terms of, you know, housing, land and property, for instance, and the impact that climate has had, environmental degradation. And it would be really interesting to know what access to information do refugees have in this environment. So that was one case study that we thought about. And the second one is thinking about labour migration in the GCC countries. And just the incredibly high numbers of the populations in some of the GCCs, and that impact with rising temperatures and an increase in heat-related mortality risks. What is the impact of this on labour groups who are often particularly vulnerable, who have very weak access to rights in the kafala system? They're often placed in a really difficult situation. They often are working in construction, they're working in spaces that they don't have access necessarily to air conditioning or to the right kind of housing that helps to mitigate some of these factors, working long hours without proper cooling. And so with that, as I said, with limited voice, rights, although there have been some attempts at policy reforms, has this filtered down into reality? Big question mark there. And what would be some of the sustainable alternatives for labour migration in GCC countries to consider necessary policy improvements? And then a third case study before I hand over to Mohammed was thinking about this issue in Yemen, this idea of the forcibly displaced becoming, if you like, almost forcibly immobile. And I think there are people in this room who have a lot of expertise on this and would have some really interesting ideas. 4 million IDPs facing huge challenges in regards to access to services, negative coping strategies, increased pressure on urban infrastructure, highly complex. So obviously climate change exacerbates these existing challenges that are in Yemen already, including rapid temperature rise and water resources, agriculture, food security. These are some of the issues that have come up already. And then you have climate-related hazards that often do impact IDP populations that are often living in places that weren't being lived in for very good reason before. And they might be particularly susceptible to some of these challenges. So IDPs in Yemen face untenable conditions and return is often not an option. It's unviable. We talked about this loss of livelihoods. And then there's the ongoing conflict, and how does that relate to people's decision-making vis-a-vis climatic issues? And what are the alternative options for IDPs in this environment, if there are any? So let me hand over to Mohammed to go through the other three ideas.
Thank you. I don't know how to address the Gaza issue, to tell you the truth, because a lot of this depends on the current conflict phase. It had already been facing many challenges, and now, if you don't mind, I'll move on. Although it is something that is worthy of more research, for many reasons that I'm sure everybody is familiar with. But the question is when. So we'll go on. Now, Iraq's marshlands are an excellent research opportunity because so much happened there. Some of the activities were triggered, or some of the challenges were triggered by human action. So what used to happen there is that during the Iran-Iraq war, This was a hideout for many people that the regime in Iraq at the time wanted to fight. So what they did is they cut off all water sources. So they dried it up. And the communities that lived there had been living there for about 5,000 years. So they had their own culture, practices, something really unique. Post 2003, a lot of the dams were removed and water was allowed to flow again. However, the lack of supply of water through both rivers that are feeding these marshlands was reduced because partially by the decreased rainfall and also because of dams were built in other countries that feed into this area. So it is a really interesting area to study. Can we move to the next one? Especially in terms of the ecosystem collapse and its relationship to displaced people and how to try and preserve their culture and so on, and how internal mismanagement of water resources and dam constructions upstream have increased the suffering of the Arab Muslim people. The future outlook of what does the future hold for these populations, because it's not just about water shortage, it's about a vast, what's the word? A vast something. Yeah, I'm losing my, so many factors are now part of the challenges. So there's mismanagement of natural resources, there's oil drilling, I understood, in areas adjacent. So there are many factors that need to be addressed, and it's also surrounded by 4 major cities. Next slide, please. Al-Bidoun, I think Dr. Lucy already touched upon this topic. We know that the main communities of Al-Bidoun are concentrated between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, but we also know that there are other Bidoun communities all over the region, including a few thousand in Jordan, as we understood. So how will they cope with climate change, especially since, as we said before, they do not have the privileges that local citizens have and that enable them to adapt to the increasing heat waves and so on, or temperatures and so on. What else? I think that's it. I won't go on and on. Let's make the best of the time available, and maybe we go back to the questions that we'd appreciate it if you could discuss amongst yourselves. So if you can go back to your tables, and what time is it now?
It's 22.
20.
So in for half an hour?
Half an hour. Yeah. And then we'll do reporting as we did last time. Thank you. Please.
Are there any quick questions? Very quick questions.
Yeah, that's
about the
true.
presentation?
Yeah.
Not exactly on the
Microphone.
But I don't know, Wissam, maybe
We've still got 5 minutes, so we could do a few quick questions.
Well, I'm afraid if we started answering the questions,
Okay.
they won't ask the questions amongst themselves.
Okay, then since we gave, let's finish this question.
Okay, and I'll see if it's if we can answer it or if we have.
It's a very quick one. It's just out of curiosity. Since we have this scenario and we're dealing with most of the cases go on such processes, climate data allows us to work more on predicting displacement and mobility. So I wonder if the findings that you guys came up with, any data available, any model in place for the region, trying to connect the dots between human mobility and climate change, in terms of using this data to predict future movements in the region. DRC has some experience on models like this, so it would be fantastic to.
So you want to answer or should I answer? Okay, I was afraid of this question. I know it will be coming at some stage. No, it's fine. You need to do a lot of this modeling eventually. We did not have the time or the capacity to go through this process. But this is really essential because there are models, there are softwares, there are people who know about all of this, and maybe eventually when hotspots are chosen, maybe part of the criteria would be applying these different scenarios. So 100%. Thank you. Good, so let's move to the breakout sessions, please.
By the way, there's a model in you did.
Yes. Yeah, but I will do something for the viewers.
I'm sure you don't think about it.
Nice.
Let's not separate the communities into residents and non-residents, because the impact of climate change is actually happening upon the whole community. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for raising these points. Okay, we'll move now to this group. Who's your reporter? You again?
It was agreed. So firstly, we discussed pastoralism and still as a topic that there's still very little understanding of, and that there's very little understanding of overgrazing, documenting perhaps how, say, pastoral mobile communities, how are they moving, how are they adapting in different ways, changing their mobilities, what might that look like. We also discussed the notion of trying to do surveys, trying to understand how people feel about the future, but also realizing that we're talking about very huge populations. We're talking about the needs. If we're looking, we discussed approaches that gather information from the ground, how people are experiencing what people want themselves. But that also means huge numbers of people within Syria itself. There's 5.5 million people displaced just internally there. So we're talking about huge numbers of displaced people if we're wanting to actually, the resources needed to produce that research. But also that it is important to have this participatory approaches, to have ways that people from the ground can feed in, to have approaches that capture those experiences. We also discussed that we need to think more about the heterogeneity of different groups. That often we kind of, Syrian refugees are not one thing within Jordan, and they take their living conditions, where they're living, what their access to different resources varies hugely. And that when we think about mobility, these different categories, even within these different groups, within different locations, within different regions. So if we're going to introduce durable solutions for different groups, we need to account for that. And thinking about local integration, what does that mean? And we talked about spatial mapping and a lack of mapping really done, so mapping overlays, for instance, if we were looking at issues such as overgrazing and pastoralism, looking at changing mobility, having a map looking at land degradation alongside changing mobilities, is there a correlation? There's very little of that being done. We did talk about Gaza and another issue around environmental destruction. We now know is a tool of war as well. We now know that exacerbating environmental destruction is making land unlivable is now a tool of war, that's been done. We need to understand that and understand how conflict and war can exacerbate situations. Also that a lot of the problem is that the areas where a lot of displaced people end up being in are areas where governments have no interest in improving the environmental situation. They've been put in this area to to kind of keep them away, but the government just wants to maintain, like, doesn't actually want to make areas. So where a lot of displaced people are also not areas where governments want to improve environmental situations. So that's something we need to think about. Again, the urban, we've got lots of ideas. We also think that we're also talking about research around how people feel connected. If we've got a lot of displaced people, if we've got a lot of people who are moving, constantly moving within, how do they feel connected? How do they identify with land? And how might that impact on kind of environmental work? How people, if we think about complexities of layers of attachment. We also talked about education as well, what makes people engage in environmentally bad activities. We need to think as well about environmental climate change linked to development as well. People can engage in environmentally friendly practices if they have development. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. So one of the issues is Syrians are also internally displaced, and as in Yemen, there are different political what should we call them, systems, I don't know, in different parts of the country. So that creates a mobility issue even within Syria or Yemen or these areas. And I remember a few years ago, I developed a structure to say the children now went to the Zafiri camp. And a lot of the people within the Al-Nafaq area have relatives in Syria. So originally it's the same region. So what happened is that they had more members of their own tribe coming from Syria than the numbers of the members of this tribe in Jordan. So it was like they were 50,000 and they got 70,000 from the same tribe. So it's really interesting to look into all of these issues and how they relate to some of the livelihoods and sources of income historically. Good. Maybe, how much time do we have? Yeah, I know, but I want to see if we have enough time.
We have 5 minutes.
Oh, we only have 5, because I wanted to open the floor for questions
We'll have
from other groups.
later on, after James sums up the discussion, we can have
No, I meant regarding the comments there, but it's fine. If you have 5 minutes, we'll stick to the time. Who's your reporter here? Okay.
Thank you. I'll try to move through this quickly in the interest of time. I think something that was highlighted as a kind of step 0 is to understand what the specific data gaps are, which requires a mapping of existing data sources. So
I don't think the mic is on.
Can you hear us?
There needs to be a mapping of data sources to understand the precise information gaps, understanding that would be, this might look very different in, let's say, Iraq versus Yemen, what we know and what we don't know. And the need to bring together remote sensing data alongside community level data that's often collected by international organizations and NGOs. I think we had an interesting discussion as to whether the extent to which we can isolate climate change as a push factor, and I guess when and where this is useful, as noted in the report, because it's often one factor among many. I think there were some questions as to, organizations feeling they didn't know where to target. So I think, this presents an information gap, is understanding where programs need to occur. I think there's a need for qualitative information that can be collected through communities, maybe through a focus group discussion method on decision making, but also knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions of climate change. And just to circle back to an earlier point, I think one aspect of this that's interesting is that communities themselves might not explicitly identify climate change as the reason for the movement, but it doesn't mean it's not relevant. And I think that's an important question for researchers, is how do we account for this, knowing that, they might not use these terms, but it nevertheless is relevant. So it might involve, again, remote sensing data, incorporating that alongside quantitative and qualitative data collected through communities, but also, the use of proxy indicators that are maybe more material and concrete, so just focusing on the impact on agricultural livelihoods. So I think there's a need for area-based assessments in areas of, migration and displacement. So conflict-induced displacement in the case of Yemen, maybe integrating climate sensitivity into those assessments in the case of Iraq, I think it would be interesting to understand how these people who have been uprooted by environmental factors have been integrated in these new locations and what needs they might have in this process. So I think we emphasized a need for there to be greater education on these issues. There needs to be a gender lens, as we talked about specifically, and involvement of local leaders. I think this is more or less it. Yeah, I think I can do. Does anyone want to add anything? So I think we need to understand the information gaps and then proceed accordingly based on what we identify. So.
Thanks a lot. All right, so I hand it over to Jane, who will do a brief summary of the discussion.
Okay, excellent, thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Can you hear me okay, Wasim? You kept telling me I was too quiet. Is it better?
Very well.
It's fine, good. Okay, so a lot discussed in a really short time period. Thank you so much to everyone for participating. Thank you so much for your engagement and sharing your thoughts. I think this has been a really good and helpful conversation. It will definitely, there's no doubt, help our work going forward, but hopefully it can build on a community and thinking and taking the conversation forward more generally. So I think that's my first really important point is thanks so much for joining us and for participating. And thanks also for managing a hybrid event. These are not easy, and I'm really happy with how this one has gone. So thanks as well for bearing with that. I think what we've talked about shows the relevance and even the urgency of developing the evidence base on this topic much more. We're all very much agreed on the complexity of the topic, and we have a big challenge regarding the all-encompassing nature of climate change impacts. They're entering into almost every sphere of people's lives, but also the complex interrelationship between climate change impacts and all the other factors that affect people's lives. And this is before we even start embarking on the topic of migration dynamics, mobility, and how people who've already migrated are affected, or people who haven't yet will be affected. So yeah, the scope and scale of the challenge is enormous, and I think we're all very aware of that, but also very aware of the nuance that is needed, and we mustn't reduce this too much, and we mustn't oversimplify. But at the same time, we should not be daunted by the scope and scale of the issues, and it seems that we're not, which is also good news. Points that I particularly want to draw on from this discussion to feed into our thinking and work on the topic, particularly in the Middle East. The question of policy, it's a really important one. We can't talk about climate change or mobility without talking about policy and the impacts of government policy on mediating or aggravating climate change impacts and mobility dynamics. Again, it's a vast topic. We're not talking about just one policy. We're talking about a multitude, but it's important not to ignore this. Now, whether further research can go into the scope of everything, maybe not, but multiple projects working together, maybe we'll start to chip away at finding out more about the impacts of policy. Related to this is climate change can't be used as the reason for everything, and governments must be held accountable for their policies and their impacts on the vulnerability of their populations. And moving away from governments, community is really vital. We need to understand communities' perceptions, which is what we really focused on in the past as MMC. And we need to understand communities' perceptions, thinking, reactions, intentions around climate change impacts, and what they do about them, and what they want to do about them, and what they don't want to do. So that's a really interesting point, which is relevant for us, and hopefully we'll be taking forward. In between that, there was a little bit of a mention of local leaders and local government. And I think that's really vital, particularly when you talk about migration and mobility dynamics. The role of local leaders and local government in managing the situations is key. And while we've talked a lot about generalities, because this was a pretty sort of big report trying to look at the region, and from that sort of big bird's eye view that we were trying to take, we're trying to then be able to pin down where we go next. the key is that context is really, really important. Each context is specific precisely because of the interplay between all of these different factors when it comes to climate mobility. So many of the most vulnerable are so vulnerable because of the specific interaction between climate change impacts, policy, economic factors, and how they're affecting them where they are and when they are. So we need to find the specific data gaps for particular places and times and populations. So we've talked a little bit about mapping, a lot about modeling. I could talk about modeling for a long time, but at the moment, I mean, there's work being done and we're all moving forward, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And I think the qualitative data and the work that we've been doing so far and understanding community perceptions and feeding that into the mapping and the modeling are also very, very important things to take into account, especially when we're talking about people's decision making. A little bit of a talk about how we isolate climate change as a driver, again, about this complexity. One is understanding to what degree we can isolate it and understanding the importance of knowing that climate change is one specific factor. But I think there's also something to think about, as we've been discussing, about the value of that we need to understand that, yes, some people move for multiple different reasons, whatever happens, and that these interactions are also very important to understand. Finally, in some more specifics, I think rural to urban migration came up a lot as an existing phenomenon that is probably being intensified through climate impacts, but also gender, looking at gender issues, looking at age, looking at generational issues. And I think a new point that has just come up is understanding how changes in climate impacts and mobility dynamics are going to change social relations and connections between population groups. And I think that's a really interesting point to explore a little bit further. Finally, we started talking about, saying that climate mobility is happening now, but we're also finishing by saying it's going to happen more in the future, and we still don't know quite how it will happen in the future. So how we try and tackle both of those issues, we acknowledge that it's happening now and try to understand what is going on now. We also really need to understand what's going on in the future. I'm sure that's not everything, but that's what I've picked up so far. Thank you very much. And yeah, I'd like to pass over to you and maybe if anyone's got questions or final thoughts.
Thank you, Jean. I can see that Carol has joined you. She hadn't introduced herself at the beginning.
That's great. This is a good opportunity. So yes, Carol's been in and out, and we had a chance for her to introduce herself to the breakout group online. But it would be great, Carol, if you could say hi to everybody in the room before we finish.
Sure. I'm sorry about that. I'm double tasking. I had a chance to meet in the working group. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Carol Shushani Sherfain. I'm director of the Arab Center for Climate Change Policies at ESQA in Beirut. And I also coordinate with our team the RICAR initiative. So again, you're mentioning the evidence-based and the science to help inform this work. I really encourage people to visit the RICAR, RICCAR.org website. It has all open access to data, scenarios, climate indicators that you can use for research. So I encourage you to visit and don't hesitate to ask if you need more details. RICAR.org.
Thank you, everyone. We still have around 7 minutes if there are any final comments. Yeah, here or online. Is there anything we missed? All right, I guess we covered everything. Well, I want to echo what Jay said. Thank you very much for the participation and also for this very interactive discussion. Yeah, I think it's quite important to bring people from different backgrounds, practitioners, policymakers, researchers, etc., and also kind of working on different contexts within the region or at a regional level. I think this was quite informative. Yeah, thank you also to those who attended online. Really, this was amazing. So I think we're done for now. We do have lunch. Starting maybe in around 5 minutes. So maybe something that I would like to highlight is that we will be sharing a post-event survey. If you could please fill it out, this would be very helpful for us to improve our work, but then also make sure that what we produce is relevant to those who are responding to people on the move and climate change. So, yeah, thank you to those online, and we will make sure to share with you the final report. If you would like to submit it, that would be much appreciated. Yeah.
And congrats to the team.
Thanks.
Okay. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye. Take care, and yeah, good luck. Please continue discussions over lunch.
Thank you.